Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you for today's webinar. We are very happy to have you with us. Of course, the topic of today's webinar is criminal governance during the pandemic in Cape Town and Nairobi. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Lindy Mcclagan. I am a broadcaster, journalist, and podcaster from South Africa, based in Nairobi, Kenya at the moment. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk. Now, this webinar is a presentation of research that forms part of the Global Initiative's project on criminal governance in cities during COVID-19. The project is supported by the German Agency for International Cooperation, known as the GIZ. Now, the project studied the roles played by criminal organizations in urban territories during the pandemic. It looked at how these gangs and non-state armed groups altered their activities in light of the pandemic circumstances, and also how governments and civil society groups responded. The research draws on 5 case studies in Africa and Latin America, namely Tumaco in Colombia, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, Nairobi in Kenya, Cape Town, South Africa, and San Salvador in El Salvador. Well, of course, today we zoom in on those Africa case studies, Cape Town and Nairobi. And we also discuss the parallels between the African and Latin American case studies. What we know, of course, is that gangs in fast-growing sub-Saharan Africa already have profound effects on low-income urban communities through drug trafficking, the imposition of rules, extorting business owners, providing services, and of course, the role they play in armed violence. But what exactly happened during COVID-19? Well, as we will see and hear over the course of this hour, the pandemic in some cases barely disrupted the power of gangs. In other cases, gangs adapted to the pandemic conditions, and even in some instances, they were even able to strengthen their capacity for criminal governance. Today's program begins with a short documentary titled Contested Ground: Inside Cape Town's Gang Wars. And that then will be followed by a criminal governance discussion with some excellent experts on the matter. We'll be joined by the co-authors of the Nairobi case study, Joyce Kimani, who is the Observatory Coordinator for the Eastern Horn of Africa for the Global Initiative, and Antonio Sampao, a Senior Analyst for the Global Initiative. The author of the Cape Town study also joins us, Mcclagan. He is an analyst at the GI. Now, there has been a slight change to today's program. Rukchanda Pasco, a community activist in gang-affected areas of Cape Town, who's the chairperson of the Munenberg Safety Forum, is unfortunately unable to participate in today's webinar due to unforeseen circumstances. But she is featured in the documentary that you are about to see. So you will be able to glean some of her insights on criminal governance in Cape Town. Well, without any further ado, here is that documentary. Enjoy.
Hi, man. Para was hy? Ice, buttons, stuff, alles.
There's a lot of blood in our grounds. You come on our turf and you will not belong to a gang of us, and we get you, we kill you. Because there's no mercy with them. Well, the same thing they do with us. You understand? That's every day's routine. We don't go out of our places, we don't go nowhere, because we're defending a turf.
Salut, salut. What's it do?
My job, I'm a killer. I went to prison for shooting someone dead. But because I aligned with duty, I had to do it with honor and pride.
I'm American. And at the age of 17, I joined the American gang. And at this moment, I'm 33 years in this gang. I was forced to join the gang. I had 6 brothers. 2 were so dead. All my family is a part of the American gang. And more many gangs now. The young recruit in the gangs, they making yellow trouble. They want to take control over the whole situation. And the elders can't control them.
Shots are fired in defiance of police as they arrive at the scene. People in these communities say they live in fear and the police have lost control.
The South African National Defence Force and the police have started a massive joint operation against gang violence on the Cape Flats.
Being a community worker, your door can never be closed. Your office is in operation 24/7. This is my personal journey. It's always been a fight. So you become everything. You become the counselor, the doctor, the magistrate, the policeman. You must have answers for all these ailments. Wat sal jy kies as jy 'n kans kry om 'n betere lewe van jou te maak? Dankie kerels man. So the area is well known back in the day for the Americans.
Ja, daar is nou een groep hier aan de achterkant, die Fancy Boys. Wat ook maar, ik denk zeker van die jaar af heeft hulle ook alle opwachting gemaakt. So hulle recruit en so dus Fancy Boys is Americans wat die kant is.
Beklei.
Wat op mekaar skiet.
Ja. Al twee beklei vir dieselfde turf nou, want hulle wil oorvat.
Ja.
Heeltemal oorvat. En de kost van die mensen wat nou hier bly, hulle veiligheid, die bendes voel die plekke behoort aan hulle.
You'll find gangs in our community all the time. Every second street is a gang. You can see if you enter an area, you'll see the murals on the wall. You can just feel something in the air that is amiss. But there's that sense of fear when the area is tense. You know, if there was a shooting last night, that you know that today you're going to have to watch your back. So it affects everyone's life. You don't have to be part of a gang to be killed.
There is always a worry when you move from one space to another, because why? The territories are not far from each other, it's on each other's doorstep. And nothing has been done about it for many years. It's like it's normal for this particular communities.
Ai, was jy skietery? Was jy skietery gewees?
Our community doesn't really work well with the police. There's a lot of corruption within the police force. So the community doesn't trust really the police very easily.
I'm an elder now. I had my time. I want nothing to do with the youngsters. They're gonna kill me at the end of the day. I did wrong because I was young. I was on drugs. I must steal. I must murder. I must shoot you. I must do everything to survive. I love from the community, so I must give back to the community. I got 3 kids. I got 5 grandchildren. I want them to look up to me because I must set the example.
No. She's too cute. How many days is she now?
9.
What is that? Hello, Auntie. A lot of people in the Cape Flats help gangs. These are the same people that are feeding their families.
Gangs themselves have evolved. They are more business like now than operating like a gang. If the economy and the business are threatened, that leads to violence. Who's in charge? To who does this belong? That is why we find that all gangs are at this current moment fighting.
The reason I became a gangster is because I shot most of my family dead. So I became an American not to take revenge, but to protect me and my family and the fellow people around me. This is how life I will grow up. I have no regrets because of conscience who I am. Me, I'm proud to be American. There's no other answer I can give you. It's just I'm proud to be American.
I grew up in this gang. I chose my way. I chose to go out of the house and be a gangster. But as was nou net so, paklei mekaar met vrou tot laat toe. Ons kan malik raak in ons kop. Ons is malitjies.
Well, that exclusive documentary there produced by the Global Initiative. If you missed the beginning or would like to watch it again, you can find it on the Global Initiative's website. That's at globalinitiative.net. It certainly raises a lot of questions, raises a lot of issues about criminal governance in Cape Town. If you do have questions yourself, you can write those into the Q&A box. You'll find that box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out those questions to our panelists towards the end of our program. For now, though, let's take a closer look at what we saw in that documentary. I'd like to invite Michael Mcclagan now to the conversation. He is the author of the Cape Town report. It's titled Gangs Tighten Their Grip During the Hard Lockdown. Michael, I must say what I'm struck by in the very first few moments of that documentary is the extent to which gangs are so comfortably embedded in the community. I mean, they're just casually dealing drugs while mixing with children and, pregnant ladies in the community. And later we see a drug dealer or gang member introducing his newborn baby to a researcher. Just talk us through the ways in which these gangs are so firmly embedded in Cape Town society that even during lockdown, it was hard for communities to ignore their presence.
Yes, thank you, Lindy. So that's a very, very good point. And I'll start by saying simply, these people come from those communities, and people around them who may not be part of a gang have known them since they were young, since they were little. They've grown up around them. And during my own research, and some of the interviews that I conducted, like one of the most poignant points to come out was one community member just saying, you know, these gangs, whether we like it or not, they are part of us. We know who they are. We know where they come from. We grew up with them. And that's one, explanation, one facet of how these, gangsters are so embedded in the community is because, well, they're part of the community. They were once, ordinary people, just like the people they share the space with. And then, to take that point a bit further, upon joining the gangs, many of these, gangsters do see themselves as servants to the community. And it's demonstrative of a very sycophantic relationship where it's the activities of these gangs that actually, one, terrorize like local populations, but also two, provide assistance to these local populations. And this became very pronounced during the pandemic, where the state could not adequately meet the needs of people in communities like the ones demonstrated in the documentary. And it's not new. The state has long failed to provide adequate support to these communities. Rampant unemployment and just general destitution reigns there. And during the pandemic, this became more pronounced. And it was not the state that was able to provide the necessary assistance. It was these criminal groups, these gangs. Very often, they were the ones providing money, providing food, providing just general assistance. And it had, obviously, there's the facet that obviously, these people grew up in these communities, and that there are definitely, members of these criminal groups who do have a genuine concern for their communities. But there's also a very business-like element to it too. And that is, if you maintain that legitimacy, that image of yourself being a provider to these communities, then it becomes a lot more difficult for you to be excised from these communities. It becomes more difficult for the state to combat the gang epidemic because they've become so ingratiated with these communities, because they're seen as the primary providers for these communities.
But I suppose, and you point to this in your report, it wasn't all just a rosy picture. Certainly gangs were providing assistance to communities and people in need, but there were some, strict conditions to this. Tell us about the risks then that people were taking in receiving help from gang members, as well as the fact that, even acts like donating food had another ulterior motive or other agendas involved.
Of course, and that's a very good point to make, a very important point to make, because gangs are always going to try and present themselves as Robin Hoods, as the servants to these communities, right? But like, and as I mentioned previously, there is that business-like, that conditional element to it. So what you'll see is gangs cannot continue to exist. They cannot survive without some form of community support, because, they operate in these communities. So if ordinary community members were always going to, report them to the police, or, not accept the provision of their services, then the gangs would not have a mandate to operate. So what we see is the conditional offering of support. Typically, what you'd see happen in return is people who received support from these gangs would then also have to conduct favors for these gangs, such as the stashing of weapons or drugs, or if they'd been lent money, they'd have to, pay it back at like some form of with some form of interest, or conduct favors for the gangs. And also, the more support that ordinary community members get from these gangs, the less likely community members are to take a stand against them through reporting, activities to the police, etc., that sort of thing. So we have, like I said, it's a complex and sycophantic relationship in that regard. And obviously, community members, they will struggle to survive without the support given by the gangs. So if they act against them, not only may they receive repercussions from the gangs in the form of violence or intimidation, but then that's their vessel of support also diminished. So they would actually, ironically, be acting contrary to their own interests by, reporting gang activity or acting against the gangsters, even though most people, and this also arose in the interviews I conducted, was we know the gangs are bad, but what alternative do we have? We live here, the state's not giving us support. So, I mean, I'm not proud of it, but I will keep guns, I will keep drugs for them because, I'm just trying to survive here. That's like, a mentality that arises from that.
Yeah. And Michael, just briefly, let's take a quick look at the response from government or law enforcement. Did this have any impact at all on diminishing the influence and power of gangs?
During COVID, there may have been a couple of brief periods where violence, like especially during the deployment of the army, where gang-related violence might have been quelled somewhat. But from the information, from the data we received from our researchers on the ground, from interviews that were conducted, it just seemed like it was business as usual. The state response, although there was a heavier presence in terms of law enforcement, in terms of the military, they were more focused on enforcing lockdown regulations, particularly relating to the bans on tobacco products and liquor, than they were of actually disrupting gang activity. So put simply, the state actors seemed to be going after easy targets. They were going after lockdown rule breakers, so people who weren't in their homes or people who weren't wearing masks. And they would disproportionately go after these ordinary people rather than actual, criminals. And there weren't enough, especially intelligence-driven operations, to try and disrupt gang enterprises, specifically from the more economic standpoint, like trying to disrupt the drug trade, trying to disrupt other illicit markets with which the gangs, busy themselves. So in short, the law enforcement response is inadequate, and it really didn't have much of an effect at all on gang activity. Apologies for my cat. But it actually had the opposite effect, and that is to further push community members into the arms of gangsters, because now not only is it the gangs that are providing the support, but the state is actually adversely affecting ordinary citizens, because there were numerous instances of state-sponsored violence against just ordinary community members, unwarranted violence, I would add too. And so it further entrenched the gang presence in these regions.
Thank you so much, Michael Mcclagan. We'll leave it there for now. Of course, Michael is available to answer questions towards the end of our program today. So you can write those questions in the Q&A and we will address them to him a little later. For now, though, let's turn our attention to Kenya. Of course, Nairobi, the capital city, is home to the largest number of gangs in the country. So that will be the area of focus. And for that, let's turn now to Joyce Kimani. She is the Global Initiatives Observatory Coordinator for the Eastern Horn of Africa. Over to you, Joyce.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and thank you for this opportunity. Good morning, afternoon, and evening from wherever you're watching us. My name is Joyce Kimani, as Lindsay introduced me, and I coordinate the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime office. I'm currently based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I also co-authored this report with Michael, Antonio, and my other colleagues. When it comes to criminal governance, I'll start with a little story. Last year, I visited my grandmother who lives in the outskirts of Nairobi town. And while we were there, our children were attacked by this gang who were flashy, and they wore jewelry, and they were teenagers, really young. I estimated their ages to be between 8 to 13 years. And when they accosted us, they brandished knives, and they also harassed the kids, demanding cash and jewelry and any other form of important thing that they had. After they had done their deed, these small teenage gangs walked away bodilessly and fearlessly. Unfortunately, one of them turned out to be my distant relative, and he's only 13, but he's currently at a juvenile facility undergoing rehabilitation. Yet, when I look at it from this point, He is not the first case that I've had the first case that I've encountered when it came to documenting how kids have found themselves in these gangs during the pandemic. Multiple interviews that I conducted, my colleague Ken and I conducted in semi-urban settlements like areas like Korogosho, Mathare, Dandora, and Kibra, revealed how many of the kids had been used by conduits in crime, and many more were recruited as drug traffickers, small arm traffickers, and in some scenarios they were placed by gangs in different areas so that they could act as spies. So they would sit and they would inform the people the other areas what was going, or to beg for cash as a distraction to the rest of the team who went ahead to terrorize residents. So the kids will be there, but behind the scenes, gangs will be terrorizing other residents. Other sources reported cases of women and children hiding and transporting guns and other weapons for the criminal gangs at a fee, which has become a common problem, especially, but it escalated in the last 1 year. I believe that this was partly due to the indefinite shutting down of schools across the country. And then this was also followed by the enforced and state-sanctioned suspension of any organized social meetings. So kids were not able to go to the stadiums, to other sporting facilities, which are very popular spots for gangs to meet potential recruiters. And then, for example, in various football fields, gangs would often hang around there. And then they display their flashy jewelry and cash as a means of enticing kids. These are rich areas where kids would go for gang recruitments. And then the closure of these schools by the Ministry of Education provided an opportunity for the kids who had even quit gangs to go back to them. For example, I know very many cases of young kids who went back to gangs because they had a lot of time in their hands. When it comes to gangs and their reaction to COVID, it was totally different. So some of the gangs started by soliciting help. So they would look for funds to help cushion residents against the effects of COVID-19. And with this came its different challenges. So we saw so many gangs register and hide as community-based initiatives. And then these community-based initiatives would go the extra mile. They would provide hand-washing bays. They would provide soap in several spots across the territory. And then interestingly, they also taught these welfare groups that they came about on different skills like soap making skills, and then they used this soap as a way of distributing and fighting COVID. So it was like a skill that was taught to help them earn a living. In some areas, they also conducted awareness campaign. I know in Kibra, there was a very interesting awareness campaign about the pandemic and how to deal with it and how to, mitigation measures. Some of them, they provided masks and they even provided sanitizers. Coupled with this, when it came to the pandemic, the gangs came in handy when someone lost a relative from the disease. They would often go the extra mile and they cater for the last funeral rites. So they came in and contributed a lot of fee, a substantial amount of money. So most of the residents felt that the gangs were there for them when the government wasn't there for them. But this was a measure to buy control. So what they normally did is they now started controlling the water and the electricity supply. We had a case where they would divert power lines and they would divert water pipes to their main businesses, and then which in turn they sold it to residents at an exorbitant fee. There's a case in point where the gangs actually chased NMS, the Nairobi Metropolitan Services officials who had gone to disconnect some illegally connected water, and the gangs literally chased them away. And then gangs also acted as gatekeepers in their territories. For example, they literally frustrated any aid that was to come, and no matter what you were going to contribute, was it food, was it sanitizers, masks, it had to go through them before it's handed and distributed to any of the community members. And then the same applied to anyone who was trying to come up with to sell something. For example, we know of cases where people went with lorries to the slums, to the semi-urban settlements, and the gangs would literally swing in the lorry until it reaches where it stopped. And when it stopped, they would demand their share of whatever was in that lorry. Was it food supplies? And then they would also demand a fee for the lorry to be parked or for the lorry to operate in that area. And then, however, due to the economic shock that came with the pandemic, gangs were forced to resort to opportunistic crimes, including stealing money, mobile phones, shoes, jewelry, and then they would discard them at throwaway prices. So this was a way of sustaining their living. And then, looking at it, in some cases, these gangs had to dissolve to cleaner deals. There was a lot of rise in recruitment of boda boda. Boda boda is the motorbike industry where they would distribute boda bodas. They would distribute motorbikes, and then they would ferry passengers at a fee. Unfortunately, they started controlling the boda boda stages, so they replaced this. They replaced these normal boda boda stages, and it now became controlled by gangs. So they ran the innocent people outside. They ran the people operating the industry. They ran them out, and then they started controlling these stages. So this was coupled with issues like they started robbing people using the boda boda bikes. And in one case scenario or two, I think, they even stole from a traffic police officer standing on the roadside directing traffic. In conclusion, I think the gangs they strengthened their base using, they used all approaches they could use to show their power. And it was felt, it became more dangerous to walk outside. It became more dangerous to move around with something flashy, and it became more dangerous just to be in some spaces. I remember there's a time where the gangs literally would harass people at the Dandora dump site. One interview that we did, several interviews that we did, indicated that even police who were going to enforce curfews, enforce COVID-related curfew. They were going to enforce those curfew-related laws, were even chased away literally by these gangs. So I feel like they strengthened their base, and my biggest fear is this, even if it's not being felt, it's going to be witnessed a lot in next year when you go for elections. And this is when they're going to take advantage of the 1 year or 1.5 years that COVID raved Nairobi. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you, Joyce. And if I can just ask you to stay with us for a moment. You did touch on the public transport sector when you spoke about the borders, but there's also, of course, the matatus, the sort of 15, 16-seater minibus taxis that are very, very popular here in Nairobi and in other parts of Kenya. Just tell us about the extent to which gangs exercised extortion activities on the owners of these matatus.
Oh, the matatu industry is really interesting for me. And I got to feel it because I'm a matatu user. So I got to feel it from the word go. The first thing that came up with, let me first give a brief about the matatu industry. And it's reported that this PSV sector already loses about 30 million daily as a result of corruption, which in turn escalates its operation costs. So looking at it from, this was even before the pandemic. So when it comes to the particular pandemic, the regulations that came with the pandemic anticipated that every matatu should provide hand sanitizers for all passengers before boarding the vehicles. And the vehicles needed to be cleaned twice a day. Looking at it also that before any long-distance operators operating in the matatu industry, they were required to have a detailed list of their passengers as a result, so that to track COVID cases. And then to prevent contamination, the Kenya officials, I remember there was an official that was passed by the Ministry of Transport, where it indicated that the matatus will carry half of its capacity. So a bus would carry only 30 passengers and not more than 60% of their capacity. So these guidelines that came, they were meant to control the industry, which ferries about thousands of people every day from one destination to another. But as expected, extortionist gangs took advantage of this. They manned the stages. Where I operate from, I know that there are actually different types of gangs who ask for money from any matatu driver. But what happened during the pandemic is, because they were carrying half capacity, they would demand more. They would demand more from the passengers, and in turn, the gang members would demand more money from the matatu operators. And this was also witnessed by police officers who were picking bribes. They were also asking for a bigger amount of bribe. I remember in one interview with a matatu driver saying that in a place where they normally pay a bribe of about $1, 100 Kenya shillings, they were being asked for double of that amount. So it was really interesting to see how both parties, the gang members and the police, were taking advantage of the COVID pandemic. Then, of course, the gangs continue to harass matatu drivers and owners as the pandemic raged on. We have cases where gang members would tell a particular driver that he can't operate in a certain route. I know the Nairobi-Rongai route was quite popular for this, where gangs would say this matatu has to pay us for this particular period because we have to feed our drivers and our conductors, our turn boys. So they would demand a particular amount, like a round figure, demanding that we need this before at least this month end, or 2 months. In addition to the matatu, I think I mentioned, the protection fee was also paid. Gangs would demand for a protection fee so that your matatu remains in operation during the pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you so much for that. And of course, Joyce's report, written alongside Ken Opala and Antonio Sampao, is available on the website. It's titled Communities in Crisis, Gangs in Charge. I think what we've heard so far certainly highlights the extent to which armed criminal groups are able to set and enforce rules, provide security and other basic services, intimidate communities, of course, and often hold them in their grip, as we've seen throughout COVID-19. But for more on this now, let's bring in Antonio Sampao. He is the project lead for this study on criminal governance in urban cities. Antonio, can you tell us a little bit about the broad findings of your research? Of course, this went beyond Africa, looking at Latin America too, but give us an idea of the overall conclusions of the study on criminal governance during the pandemic.
Thanks, Lindy. Yes, so I was really struck by some of the statements, especially the personal sort of experiences that Joyce reported on youth involvement with gangs, because that was definitely one of the most striking and commonalities that we found in the 5 cities that we studied for way more than a year on criminal governance. The fact that children and adolescents, teenagers were more exposed to the areas with gang presence and to the gangs themselves, of course, because of closures of schools, and also the fact that for many people in those communities, one thing that many interviewees told me when I was doing research on Rio de Janeiro, that these children, underage minors, they were, because the social fabric in those communities were so sort of fragmented, broken, that many of the families didn't have like the capacity to keep their kids in the house all the time, and they were being exposed to gang culture a lot more. So that was definitely something that resonates with what Joyce said. But generally, we understand criminal governance as instances in which armed criminal groups set and enforce rules, provide security or other basic services. So basically, we're looking for cases of criminal groups fulfilling some of the roles that are traditionally expected from governments. But it's important to note, as I think Michael and Joyce have done, that this is not just a replacement of one service provider for another, just like you would replace a mobile phone company for another, but actually it's about the imposition of binding rules over by a gang, a criminal group, over an impoverished and socially marginalized population that doesn't have a choice really, if not to obey. So this criminal governance involves letting the decisions that influence people's health, in the case of the pandemic, on the whims of a local gang commander, which often impose extortion security taxes on local businesses. So in Nairobi, for instance, Joyce mentioned the case of water. Water in informal settlements during the pandemic and before has been sold by criminal groups for a higher price sometimes than in wealthier areas, because in the wealthy areas they are regulated by a company, following government regulations and all of that, whereas in informal settlements many times they siphon the water and provide for whatever amount they choose. So these rules, of course, vary from city to city, from area to area. It's a highly local phenomenon, but also one that has many things in common. So, for instance, criminal governance has in common in those 5 cities the fact that they are enabled by the neglect, inefficiency, and sometimes the complicity of some state actors. So criminal governance tends to concentrate in low-income urban areas where there's population density, unplanned urbanization, this informal character of the settlements provide cover for illicit economies, such as drug trafficking, but also plentiful opportunities to extract taxes from local businesses and nearby businesses. And this ties to another common characteristic. With the informal settlements, the state, via its institutions, especially law enforcement, the justice sector, they are not completely absent, but they are quite weak and unreliable. I think this the word unreliable here is the most appropriate one, because sometimes it's not just an incapacity to provide these services, especially policing, but also a perpetuation of a model of policing that doesn't really take into consideration the enforcement of law in the sense of providing communities with safety, but repressive measures against gangs, which sometimes and often cost the lives and causes shootings and injury or death of bystanders in those densely inhabited communities. So these are some of the common sort of threads that we identified in this research. And just to emphasize that, I think it's very important for the wider public to understand this challenge specifically of criminal governance, because there are vast urban areas, even inside large cities within democratic countries, where communities answer to actors that are effectively local autocratic rulers. So Brazil, where Rio de Janeiro, our case study, is located, is in the G20. Colombia is where Tumaco, another case study, is located, is a member of the OECD. And South Africa and Kenya are among the top African economies. So I think it's time that we shift a little bit the focus from looking at crime as sort of sometimes as something akin to mindless violence or something that is repetitive and sort of endless, and examine more deeply the problems involving flawed public policies and state institutions. So I'll stop there, and I welcome any comments and questions and a discussion on this.
Thank you so much, Antonio. And indeed, if you do have any questions or comments, please type them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Just type them in there and I will read them out to our panelists. We do have one question there so far. So let's start with that. This question is from Ngozi Louis Ozomam. Ngozi asks, bearing in mind that gangs are deeply embedded and ingrained in communities, making it difficult for law enforcement agents to apprehend them, will it be better to allow the communities to use alternative methods like flogging to fight the scourge of gang groups? She mentions, of course, that flogging is particular to communities in Southeast Nigeria, where gang members are into the sale of methamphetamine. But this does raise the question of community responses. So I think this is a good question for all three of our panelists. What methods have communities themselves adopted to try and fight back against the influence of gangs? Is it vigilantism? Is it community-based organizations? Antonio, perhaps we'll start with you for a broad view of community responses to gang power or gang influence in these urban areas.
So communities have a very important role in, I wouldn't say regulating, but in finding answers and mitigating some of the problems related to gang violence, and especially when it comes to behaviors that are harmful and predatory to the communities themselves. So for instance, a community such as Maré, a large slum complex in Rio de Janeiro, where I did some research, there are 3 gangs that are based there, 2 gangs and 1 militia. They divide territories among themselves. If there is an issue involving recruitment of a young man into a gang or some grievance in the community, the communities and the local organizations that are based there, the local trusted community activists, they have authority, they have moral authority to intervene and negotiate with the gangs. So that allows for communities to have a very important sort of moderating influence on some criminal organizations that the state, which, through be it, police or judges or, whatever institution you choose, are often seen as external, as sort of alien entities. So communities do have a moderating influence, but it's important not to, I think that the state and civil society, they have to thread a fine line there, because it's important not to give in to sort of vigilante and justice sort of narratives. So the issue of flogging was mentioned in the question. What we've seen in many cases around the world, in Latin America and Africa, is that vigilante groups that emerge through a discourse of protecting the communities, they can often result in they can often devolve into criminal organizations by themselves. And actually, in the study on Rio de Janeiro, there is a very clear, stark illustration of that, which is the issue of the militias in Rio. The militia, the name is quite unique to Latin America. There aren't many Latin American countries that have like a militia problem these days. But basically what it means is that they are groups, they're criminal organizations, armed criminal organizations that are formed by former or off-duty police officers, military police officers mainly, and they have, because they come from a state institution, they have very deep connections to the state, so they can sort of legalize or make the state overlook some of their illicit activities. So that makes them very potent. They emerged initially as a sort of vigilante organizations by off-duty or former police officers who came to the communities and said, look, here, the drug traffickers will not enter, we will protect you, we have arms, we are trained in inflicting violence, so we're going to protect our communities. And they started demanding sort of security taxes and all of that. And today they are a massive problem, controlling areas, imposing extortion, and also, ironically and sadly, also starting to operate in drug trafficking, which is what they started to sort of go against in the first place.
It is quite ironic indeed. Michael, let me come to you now for the same question, but now just in the context of Cape Town. I know, of course, we've seen in the past in South Africa, similar groups that started out with a vigilante role, but became criminal groups themselves in South Africa. The one that I recall was PAGAD, People Against Gangsterism and Drugs. But what is the situation like today, especially in the context of COVID? Is there a role for community members to play, as Antonio called it, a moderating role or have a moderating influence that the state lacks when coming to the point of engaging with gangs?
Of course, and communities are always going to have a huge role, because ultimately it's these communities that are the base from which the gangs operate. So they can't operate without community support. So the first question we have to ask is, how do we make these communities less dependent on these gangs? And I mean, obviously that would be, through one way would be through service provision, whether it be state mandated or through community organizations. Like in terms of the latter, Ruxanda Pasco is doing just that. Obviously the coverage is just not enough to alleviate some of the more disparate and desperate situations. But initiatives like that are absolutely necessary. And in terms of mediation, very often it is ordinary community members who sometimes come together to try and mediate disputes between gangs. So it may seem ironic because you're sitting down with these criminal groups, but you ultimately want an outcome that at least alleviates, threats of violence against the community, even if it's, through collateral damage, even if the threats of violence are not directed at the civilian population. Ultimately, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage, especially with the number of firearms available in the Cape Flats and similarly affected areas. So community members very often do stand up, usually people with long standing in the community. Sometimes it may be from religious organizations. Other times it may be people who were gangsters themselves and understand how these people operate, who will act as mediators. Unfortunately, you also get instances where opportunists come to the fore, self-styled gang mediators, but really they're just posing as such, who use the opportunity to gain some personal legitimacy when really they're actually maybe taking a cut on the side. It's very complex, but in short, communities will always have a very pertinent role to play in terms of addressing the gang scourge, because they form a support base for these gangs. It may be unwilling in many cases, and as we discussed, like because of the sycophantic relationship, because they're dependent on these gangs, they will perform services for the gangs too. They'll perform reciprocal services because they're in a difficult situation. So going back to the initial point is, how do we make communities less dependent on these criminal groups? And service provision is one such way. And it's a discussion we can have, going forward, and should have going forward a lot. But I hope in short that answers the question.
It does indeed. Thank you so much, Michael. Well, let's now turn to the context of Nairobi, Kenya. And for that, Joyce, let's come to you. Of course, I myself have lived in Kenya now for 6 years in Nairobi, and I'm no stranger to the stories we've come across about vigilantism, about communities taking justice into their own hands and responding to criminal groups. Just tell us more about how this has tended to play out in Nairobi as communities seek to gain or regain a sense of influence over the gangs that have power in their communities.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. When it comes to gaining control, a lot of projects that we've done is we've seen a lot of community-based initiatives, especially from reformed gang members who are actually taking it upon themselves to help these upcoming gangs recruits. For example, I know of a gang member who we talked to in the last, I think, a week ago, and he was telling us he's helped about 2,000 gang members reform since 2016. So we've seen a lot of personal initiatives when it comes to former gang members who are really interested in stopping this vice. During the pandemic, we also saw a lot of, I know, interacted with a lot of former gang members who were literally going on the ground, advising kids not to join gangs, looking for alternatives. For example, they would do football tournaments, they would do book reading clubs, they would do sports like basketball and baseball, just in an attempt to help them not join in the gangs. And this was quite positive, because we saw that kids who were otherwise enticed by these gangs divert their attention to something else. We saw, inclusive of that, I remember seeing a lot of art that was done by kids who were in gangs, 8-year-olds who were beginning to join gangs, but their attention was diverted into drawing, and they came up with really interesting pictures of just life in the slums, or they would do photography. So I think that was one of the strongest approaches I saw when it comes to dealing with the gang issues. We also saw a lot of initiatives by local leaders. For example, we had a lot of Mathare Social Justice Network and Dandora Justice Network, and who would come together and say, we are going to fight this recruitment. We are going to help these youth who are trying to rehabilitate, to get from this crime. And it was quite interesting to see even local heroes decide that they were going to fight the gang problem. And of course, it had its downside, because most of the human rights defenders in the areas ended up being threatened either by the gang members themselves or by key politicians and key businessmen who ran these gangs. We had a case where a security officer, a policeman, literally threatened a human rights defender with death, just because he was going out of his way to help these gangs these gang members reform. So it's a very thin balance. It's a very thin balance, but I think the communities are trying, and they are doing really well at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce. We do have just a few minutes left. I'd like to use the time perhaps just to ask Antonio one more question. One of the things that comes up in both the Cape Town and Nairobi reports specific to the COVID-19 lockdowns was the harsh law enforcement that played out during the curfews. So governments were particularly, or sorry, rather law enforcement or security forces were particularly heavy-handed, and we had a number of cases of police brutality reported. Can you just comment on how this inadvertently led people to find a sense of safety and security from gangs rather than police?
Yeah, the law enforcement problem, the heavy-handed, iron-fisted sort of response by police was a pretty common finding throughout the case studies. In the African context, in the Nairobi and Cape Town case studies, that played out more in relation to the pandemic and through the police enforcing the curfew regulations in the slums more than towards the gangs themselves. Whereas in Latin America, you saw a lot of police repression and violence originally aimed at the gangs, but also having spillover effects on the communities. So through stray bullets and lots of innocent bystanders getting killed and injured. So what happens with that is that whereas it's important to bear in mind that like we said in the beginning, that the alternative gang provision of such services, including security, is not an option that the communities make, but it's rather imposed on them, and they don't have a choice other than obeying that. What I mean by that is that this protection that the gangs provide from rival gangs. So this is our territory, and they regulate it through, you can't conduct theft, you can't, conduct rape, and they have some basic rules, but also comes accompanied by extortion and predatory behaviors. So the biggest harm in the long term of this police repression, I think, is by reinforcing the sense that the state is not a reliable partner for these communities. And that is a very, very, very impactful, something that carries repercussions for, for years to come, because like I said before, it's not that the state cannot enter these communities. They can enter and the police goes there. But if there is no regular community-oriented policing, when people have problems and when they need to respect some authority or obey some rules, it's gonna be the authority that is present there all the time, which tends to be the gangs, whereas the state is sort of this outside authority. So for the state, or for a more positive sort of form of the state to have more a permanent authority, it needs to provide more regular and reliable services and regulations to these communities.
Well, thank you so much, Antonio. I think that is where we'll have to leave it for today, as we are almost out of time. But thank you so much to the panelists, Antonio Simpao, Joyce Kimani, and Michael Mcclagan, for their contribution to this discussion today. And of course, there is more to this conversation. You can actually join us again next week, where we'll be hosting another webinar on this topic. It's titled From Gang Curfews to Predation, Criminal Governance During COVID. Now, this event will summarize the main findings of the entire report that's been conducted on this topic. It will also include a short video that contains interviews with former gang members, as well as civil society leaders and conversations with experts. We'll be joined once again next week with Antonio Simpao, as well as Juan Jose Martinez de Buisson. All this information is available on the website. You can also find all the reports of the case studies if you go to globalinitiative.net. Do visit the website, take a look at all the research on transnational organized crime that is being recorded and studied through the Global Initiative. Thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion. Goodbye and